Hello, this is Aimless Ramblings, episode 5, and this is Simon.
This is Tim.
Sam.
And today we'll be discussing the interesting topic of whether labeling is important to our society. And to start off with, we're going to be throwing that off to Sam.
So I was having so scientist by background, specifically a biologist by background. So naming shit is kind of like 80% of what we do, right? So I thought, it'd be interesting, to have a look at the history of the naming stuff. And so the oldest forming of naming shit we've got essentially is what we use in everyday parlance, primarily. Like, there's no scientific difference between a cow, a heifer, a bull, and a steer. They're all whatever the fuck a cow is. I don't even know. Buffalos, something like that. But our folk taxonomy as such gives us a different meaning. Like, we know a bull is a mature male. We know a steer is a male that's been a heifer, young female, no calves. A cow's just a female one that's had at least one calf. Whereas the scientific, in at least biology, taxonomy, attempts to create a different form of order, but that's not always been the case. So, the oldest famous one probably is old mate Aristotle. Gotta love the fella, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And his major two divisions were things with blood, things without blood. So like a plant in his mind, such as the fig, doesn't have blood, so it goes into that category. Man, such as men, have blood, so we're going to go in the blood category. He probably didn't look into it too hard, because things like squid, octopuses don't have blood apparently, but they do. But anyway, he's oldie time. Obviously, they couldn't cut stuff in half. And that kind of led into, essentially, like all of his crap, it hung around for a long time, up until like the medieval age, essentially. And then, post-Renaissance, Renaissance and post-Renaissance, we actually start finally as a culture breaking away from Aristotle, which is nice. We get De Plantis, which is essentially the plants, right? And that's one of our first like scientific taxonomies, which results eventually in the modern one we have, with the I've forgotten what it's called. It's where it's got two names, but essentially, it's evolved until we've gone from the folk, which is entirely based on a human and a human society's relation with the animal. Like in France, a heifer is not a heifer, it's a something else, sounding French. In China, or in Korea. Yeah, le heifer. Whereas, so essentially, the way you interact with the things is what determines its names. Like the thing with Inuits and snow, or the Scandinavians and waves. Whereas now the scientific naming is more designed on attempting like a sterility.
So yeah, I was actually going to echo what you're saying there in terms of how the taxonomy of a culture is intimately related to the way in which it interacts with the world. So, for instance, Malaysia, a country near and dear to my heart, but there's a term, lubang hati, which we would translate to subconscious. What it actually means, though, literally, is lubang, which is the term for a still place of water at the base of a river where fish like to accumulate, and hati, which means literally the heart or mind. So because their culture has a lot to do with rivers, a lot to do with fishing, and a lot to do with seamanship, they've taken obviously a word which we don't really have a very good equivalent for with lubang, and they've sort of morphed it with their own conception of mentality, which I suppose is much closer to a Chinese conception of heart mind than any sort of Western idea of the suke or psyche. But do you think, Sam, that potentially like science is a cultural phenomenon? It emerges from a culture, emerges from Western culture initially, and then has sort of become slightly more cosmopolitan as time has gone on. But would you agree that the taxonomy that science has produced is in its own way merely a product of the way that science has attempted to instrumentalize language? in the same way that, say, for instance, the Malays instrumentalized language towards fishing, or, the Inuit instrumentalized their relationship with the snow and nature.
I would say possibly to a degree, but it's meant to be devoid of culture, is the whole concept of the scientific names. I mean, obviously they use Latin words, so it can't truly be devoid of culture, but it's attempting to find something that doesn't have this cultural weighting to the terms, because no one natively speaks Latin anymore. So we don't actually know the weightings behind these words. So we've taken a dead language effectively and applied them to name things, because when I call like musula or whatever, the common mouse, right? Anyone that calls it that it doesn't mean anything to me. It's just the scientific name for a mouse. And that actually, like, if you look at, say, Cass numbers for chemistry, that gets even more extreme. So I'll explain broadly what a Cass number is. I'm not sure if everyone know or not. But essentially, there's an organization called the Chemical Abstract Service, and they give every compound we discover pretty much a number. They do, something like 15,000 new compounds a day type thing. And, I think this is probably science. I'm not going to call it autistic because that's rude. It's like wrong to use that as an insult. But in its most attempt for sterile logic. So there's essentially 3 parts to a Cass number. The first is 2 to 7 digits. Then there's a hyphen, 2 digits, and then a third number, which is a single digit, which is used as a check digit. So there's modulo, which in this case modulo 10, which is, it goes from 1 through 10 and then loops back around to 1. So the way the Cass number works is if you take the second last number, so the one that's not the check number, multiply it by 1, add that to the next number to the left, multiply that by 2, so on and so forth till you get to the final one, that last digit, so the check number, will equal the sum of those in modulo 10.
I'm sorry that that's a very serious thing, but it's just...
Well, no, exactly. It's so attempting to be like sterile and logical that it's actually hilarious. But, because I don't know, what's the first compound that comes to my mind? Epinephrine, right? Epinephrine. It's got, like 13 different names you could refer to it by, based on like which chemical like taxonomy you're using, whereas a Cass number is always going to be a Cass number for it. Yeah, so it's science's attempt to make science sterile as possible from culture, which obviously, like, it uses numbers, so it's never going to be sterile from culture. You never can, but it's an attempt to remove any cultural loading.
Oh, fair enough. I was going to say, though, interestingly, would you suggest, well, first of all, I'd argue that maths is in itself a language. It's just instrumentalized towards, calculating and multiplying mathematical values.
Sure.
But the other thing is that, do you think maybe the concern with sterilizing culture is in itself indicative of a cultural value towards non-value judgments in science, which is born out of, I suppose, the Enlightenment ideal of rationality?
I would definitely say, yeah, like science, the application of robust science could definitely be viewed as a culture in and of itself. And it's people intentionally attempting to practice this culture, leaving their, in theory, goods. Like no one's ever really capable of it. But when you're conducting science or participating in science, you should leave your cultural baggage as such at the door. You should be performing this solely based on what you can actually see and observe. Blah de blah. In the case of quantum mechanics, not see or not observe.
I mean, you could observe the effects of the effects.
Yeah. Fuck quantum mechanics, guys. Anyone out there? Fuck quantum mechanics. Let's go back in time and destroy it. Yeah.
Yes. So we're getting very sciencey, and like this is really interesting stuff, and it's really valuable to what we're actually talking about. But I think Tim just wanted to discuss it from a philosophical standpoint, was it?
Well, yeah, basically a bit of a philosophical and religious standpoint. I'm going to talk a little bit about Daoism, and it's not because the Chinese have any particular claim over sort of a skepticism towards names and naming. If anything, it's something that's pretty universal, whether you're talking about the Charvaka in India or the Cyrenaics in Greece, Epicureans even, and the Pyrrhonists. But really, I think that in some ways the Chinese have put it most pithily because there are some good aphorisms in early Daoism when it comes to this stuff. So literally, one of the opening stanza of the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the seminal texts in Daoism, really deals with the idea of naming and how artificial naming is as a societal construct. So stanza 1, the way that can be followed is not the eternal way. The name that can be named is not the eternal. The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth, while naming is the origin of the myriad things. In the second stanza, sort of skipping over a few little extra bits there, which are really more to do with the concept of the Tao, which I don't want to get into too much of this one. The second stanza really looks at how by naming things we kind of create division. Like all the world recognizes the beautiful as beautiful, herein lies ugliness. All recognizes the good as good, herein lies evil. And I think it's actually summed up really well by a quote by Zhuangzi, who is probably the second most important Taoist thinker in the early Taoist tradition. The fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, you can forget about the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten meaning, you can forget the words. Really, to summarize it, I think Alan Watts, probably the foremost exponent of Taoism in the West, really summarizes these ideas quite neatly when he talks about how each individual goes through a socialization process for naming. So, for instance, each individual society, you'll have a word for the object tree. And as a child, you will learn, the word tree. For instance, in Malay, that's pokok. All right. But the thing is also you as a child are socialized, and in some ways this is not explicit, into the artificial delineations as to what is a part of that object system. So a tree's relatively easy example in some ways because it is a natural object. But a great example would be, where do you draw the lines for a family? Because, the term a family in the Western context and the modern nuclear family context, generally people think of a mother, father, and some children. Although obviously that has now been stretched out with, changing mores when it comes to same-sex marriage. And obviously people might have two mothers or two fathers these days. But when you're talking about other cultures, this idea of family can be extended both horizontally and vertically significantly. So including brothers and sisters in law, members of the village, and even members of a linguistic and ethnic group. And in some ways as well, like for instance, if we're talking about Polynesia or particularly Melanesia, one's individual relationship with a friend can be much more important than necessarily one's bloodline familiarity. So what a family is something that's very much up for debate. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest issues we have in both modern and traditional society, because obviously this is an issue going all the way back to at least 500, 600 BCE. It's something that hasn't been resolved since then. But as a society changes, these, not just the words, but the construct behind the word, the meaning and the artificial boundaries that a word delineates change. And I think, like, for instance, it can be unconscious sometimes, and sometimes it can be deliberate. An example, I suppose, would be the term racism. So if you go back to the 19th century, or maybe even earlier than that, you're talking about scientific racism. It's referring to a very specific set of ideas in a philosophical or political setting. Whereas you go into the 20th century, it becomes a broader description of both societies and individuals who hold a sort of view towards other individuals of an arbitrarily defined racial hierarchy and superiority and inferiority within that hierarchy. And nowadays there is a battle both within academia and within the media over trying to use just the pure term racism to refer to structural racism. So I think many people probably would have heard the term racism equals prejudice plus power. And it is a move to try and forcefully or even enforce that in language, both in terms of potential for achieving one's political objectives, in this case, for the people that are pushing it, trying to push an idea of greater social justice. Sorry, Sam, you had something to say?
I find it interesting you mentioned racism, right? So scientific taxonomy, difference between a person from Africa and a person from Europe. There isn't one. So, like, when you discuss this, it's just folk taxonomy, It's just the way we describe things, and it's language. Language is inherently and ultimately fluid. And I wanted to comment earlier, but you're in a good run, It's hard to pick up momentum again, but you were talking about naming things. Once you've named it, you can forget it. But could it also possibly be once you've named it, you can learn more about it? So, like, say we go back to the Odyssey, right? Sea's the color of wine, right? Because the blue hadn't been named. So without naming blue, we never could have learnt what wavelength of light is represented by blue. We could never have learnt how to make blue in all these pigments. Everything about blue we never would have learnt without naming it. So we didn't forget blue as soon as we named blue. In fact, we came to know blue only through naming blue.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But so what I'd say Zhuangzi is trying to argue is more so that we should not get so hung up on the words. And for him, his whole idea is like Daoism, like many of these early Asian religions, is really a liberation theology. It's the idea of trying to get out of one's existence. And for the Taoists, and particularly Zhuangzi, it's kind of like dropping out of society. He doesn't really care about the the humdrum of daily politics of daily life. He wants to just live a good life. And so I think the concern for a lot of Taoists, and maybe the concern for people like moderns who are concerned about the way in which language is either, policed or enforced, whether that be through the deliberate exclusion of certain names or the deliberate inclusion of others, they might be concerned with similar things. I don't necessarily agree with either of those perspectives, because I think that naming is kind of a system, and as long as the system works, it doesn't really matter. It's interesting you talk about the blue and color as a sort of perspective there, because each culture artificially divides up the spectrum as to what is a color that they're going to talk about. So, for instance, when we talk about red, there's kind of a socially arrived to understanding of what red is. And if you take someone from a different culture and you show them a color that is close to one of these artificial boundaries between two colors that has been defined in their culture, they'll find it very difficult to delineate between the two, whereas opposed to if it's right bang in the middle.
Colors.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
But I guess that goes down to naming it allows you to better understand it, because now I could say 320 nanometers, and it doesn't matter what cultural background you have. 320 nanometers is 320 nanometers. And I guess I understand the desire to let language be free as such and not attempt to force or control a meaning, but at the same time it can become quite difficult to communicate. Like an example would be, so this is shepherds counting, right? How shepherds counted back in the day. So this is from the Bowlands, which is on the westish. Any English people, please fucking forgive me. West coast of England, and then the Rathmel, which is from the eastern side. So 11. Yane Adix or Anadugs. They're both in 11. They're from 100 miles apart, but you've got no chance of understanding what you're trying to say to each other. Just another thought is, without any control, how well can we communicate? However, everyone says jig it for 20. So
Well, clearly we need to reinstitute Jiggit as the scientific increment for 20.
I think so.
Yep.
It's the only answer.
I think Simon had something to say about labeling as well.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to start off with discussing why they're on Earth. I actually decided labeling for my second time at this. Because
Good topic, by the way.
throughout the whole entire time that I've been at university, both degrees I did, labeling was this massive concept. Because when you're going through psych, it's like, oh, well, the DSM, is it beneficial to give somebody a DSM diagnosis? Because then they can get like assistance and whatnot. But also then they become labeled as a member of that society. So it's just like, when do you do that? So there's obviously this whole entire thing that there's these like medium labels we give like children. So it's like oppositional defiance disorder isn't ADHD. It's not this other thing. It's opposition defiance disorder until they're of a particular age. Then we can give them this thing because they don't want to put that stigma. And then that continued on. Yeah, it's understandable because you don't want to, make it harder for kids to have to like society lives. And then it continued on when I went into the sociology part of criminology, where they discussed like how labeling is this sort of technique we use, which can be bastardized to be, racist. It can be used to, promote prejudice and whatnot. But it's also something that we use a lot in things like stereotypes. So that's when you have a label, but you have expectations from that label. So, for example, every time I go to a doctor, I don't need to go, I don't know. They need to prove that they're actually have all this medical background. You just go, okay, you're a doctor, so you have this already level of like skill and knowledge, so I can trust you to be able to assist me with this. It's the same as like, if I went to a gardening place, I know that they'll have a particular level of knowledge about gardening supplies. It's saving me time and effort, but when it goes into like almost a negative and like a nasty realm is where it becomes difficult to actually, accept that stereotypes should be allowed. And that's why it's always so difficult.
So I think this sort of it treads into talking about the concept of heuristics. So mental shortcuts, stereotypes, as we're talking about, really are the only way that the human mind, which is a pretty it's amazing, but it's still a soggy piece of meat locked away in a bit of bone.
Speak for yourself.
It's the Well, it's all about those shortcuts the brain are taking to process incomplete data sets, which are already massive in volume, to try and give us like the best chance at realistically surviving from an evolutionary perspective. So I think that when we talk about like which of these heuristics is bad and which of them is good, it's a functional thing when we talk about which ones make us more and less likely to perform well in a societal setting. But also, in some ways, that's a moral question. So it depends on the morality of the society as to whether or not an individual's heuristics align. I would also like to say, though, a really interesting point that you brought up there when you're talking about like this idea of when you label somebody as something that they're kind of, stuck with that label. I don't know if you were going to mention it, but it's the Rosenhan experiment, which I think was published under the name On Being Sane and in an Insane Place. So basically, the experiment was where you had a bunch of psych professors who went and had themselves committed to an American psychiatric department where they basically faked a psychiatric diagnosis. And once they got into this psychiatric department, to this hospital, they actually stopped faking their disorder. And they wanted to see how long it would take going through normal psychiatric processes for them to be essentially ejected as just someone who's been faking it. And actually, the thing that was quite interesting about it was that as these people were going through the process of being in the actual hospital, there was actual real concerns by the people who were participating in the study from the outside that they weren't going to be able to get these people out, because once they'd already been labeled with this particular disorder or that particular disorder, there was confirmation bias by the doctors working in the hospital or the psychiatrists working in the hospital that these people were already crazy. So, I mean that in the sense of they had a mental health disorder. And so it was basically just these people eventually were drawn out because it was difficult to. It's sort of just shown how once we already have an understanding of somebody through one of these heuristics, how easy it is for us to just continue to confirm.
Yeah, the one particular one that was brought up in that study, yes, I was going to mention it later, but you did a perfect description of what it was the fact that they very quietly rock up to like their meal times early, which they labeled as like antisocial behavior because they weren't hanging out with other members of the society because they were doing what they thought was normal, but they had that pre-heuristic. It also works really well with delinquency. Whereas if you are associated with a delinquent or you are known to be around delinquent, you're labeled as delinquent, and then therefore people are less likely to put time and effort into you because they think you're just going to go straight back into the system. And you will because it's confirmation bias. It's like, oh, well, they're not going to help me, so I might as well go back to prison. And that's like a major issue when it comes to adolescent limited offending.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like the article, the Atlantic just recently did a pretty good article talking about the socialization of black children into a majority white society, and one of the things they talked about is how behavior by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as a child being child, by a white child that would just be seen as